5 things spiritually awake people refuse to carry anymore. Have you ever wondered why during spiritual awakening your life begins to change, not because you add more, but because you slowly let go? Carl Jung once said, "You don't become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Let's explore the 5 things spiritually awake people always quit, slowly but surely. Part 1. Letting go of the attachment to the false self-ego persona. The journey of spiritual awakening in the depth psychology perspective of Carl Jung always begins with the confrontation of the false self, the persona. Jung described the persona as the social mask that individuals wear in order to meet the expectations of others, to adapt to culture, and to gain approval or survival within a collective. On the surface, the persona appears necessary because without it we cannot function in society. Yet when one begins to awaken spiritually, the very thing that once kept them integrated into the social world becomes the prison that suffocates their authentic being. Slowly awakened individuals realize they must release their attachment to this mask if they are to ever walk the path of individuation, the process of becoming whole. At the psychological core, the attachment to the persona is rooted in fear, fear of rejection, fear of abandonment, fear of insignificance. Society rewards compliance, appearances, and achievement. The child learns early that love and validation are conditional. A boy learns that he is valued when he performs well, hides his tears, and embodies strength. A girl learns she is praised when she pleases others, looks attractive, or fulfills the family's expectations. This conditioning builds a structure in the psyche where the authentic self becomes buried beneath layers of adaptation. Jung insisted that such adaptation is useful but dangerous when it becomes the primary identity. The authentic soul begins to suffocate when the persona dominates, and the unconscious begins to revolt through dreams, neuroses, anxiety, and inner restlessness. The spiritually awakened person recognizes this dissonance. They sense the emptiness of living through appearances and external recognition. It often begins with subtle dissatisfaction, the job that looks perfect but feels meaningless, the relationship that appears ideal but lacks soul, the social admiration that leaves one feeling hollow. Jung described this as the crisis of meaning, a psychic signal that the ego-constructed self no longer sustains the soul. It is precisely in this disillusionment that the awakening begins. And the first step of awakening is the slow, painful, but liberating detachment from the persona. The nature of the persona, and why we cling to it, the persona, is essentially a compromise between the individual and society. It allows us to present a face that is acceptable, functional, and rewarded by collective norms. A doctor wears the persona of professionalism, a teacher the persona of authority, a parent the persona of responsibility. These roles help order society, but the individual mistake lies in believing that the role is the self. Jung warned that over-identification with the persona results in shallowness, rigidity, and a fragile identity, easily shattered when life circumstances change. We cling to the persona because it gives us a sense of safety. To act against it risks ridicule, loss of status, or rejection. A man who has built his whole identity as a successful executive finds himself terrified when asked who he is outside of his career. A woman who has embodied the persona of the perfect mother faces existential panic when her children leave home. The persona becomes addictive. It shields us from the terror of the unknown self beneath. Yet Jung emphasized that the soul does not vanish simply because it is ignored. The authentic self, repressed for years, grows restless in the unconscious. Nightmares, compulsions, and existential emptiness are symptoms of the soul demanding recognition. The more one clings to the persona, the louder the unconscious protests. Spiritual awakening is nothing other than the moment one begins to listen to those protests and respond to the call of the deeper self. The pain of letting go. Letting go of the attachment to the false self is not a one-time decision, but a gradual peeling away of layers. Jung often compared this process to alchemy. The base material must be burned, dissolved, and transformed before gold can emerge. Similarly, the ego's identification with the persona must dissolve through painful experiences before authenticity arises. This dissolution is often triggered by life, crises, divorce, illness, loss of career, or betrayal. Such crises shatter the persona and leave the individual naked before the unknown self. For example, a man who has built his identity on being the provider may face a collapse when he loses his job. At first, he clings more desperately to the persona, trying to prove his worth through new ventures or exaggerated efforts. But slowly the futility becomes apparent. In the silence of failure, he confronts the terrifying question, "Who am I if I am not this role?" This question is the gateway to individuation. It signals that the soul is calling for deeper identity beyond appearances. The pain is immense because the persona is not just a mask, but has become entwined with the ego's survival. To abandon it feels like death. Jung described individuation as a second birth, often preceded by a symbolic death. The false self must die, for the authentic self to emerge. Spiritually awakened individuals do not destroy the persona altogether. They still need to function in society, but they slowly withdraw their attachment to it. They learn to wear the mask without believing they are the mask. Signs of releasing the persona. As people move through awakening, several signs indicate that the persona is losing its grip. 1. Less concern with external validation. They no longer live for the approval of others. Praise or criticism feels less defining. 2. Authenticity in expression. They speak more honestly, even if their opinions go against social expectations. 3. Discomfort with superficial roles. They find it exhausting to maintain appearances that do not align with their inner truth. 4. Emergence of shadow content. As the persona dissolves, the repressed shadow rises. This can bring uncomfortable emotions, but it is a necessary step. 5. Search for meaning. Rather than chasing success defined by others, they yearn for purpose aligned with the soul. These signs reflect a shift from outer-driven identity to inner-driven authenticity. Jung called this transition the movement from persona-ego identification toward the self, the archetype of wholeness. Depth psychology and the symbolism of masks. Jung often used mythological and cultural symbols to illustrate the persona. Masks in ancient rituals represented deities, spirits, or collective forces. The actor wearing the mask did not become the god, but represented the god. Similarly, humans wear social masks to represent functions in society. But the problem arises when the actor forgets he is acting and believes himself to be the mask. In such cases, the soul is trapped. Spiritual awakening slowly reintroduces the person to the truth. I am not the mask. The realization does not mean rebellion against society or abandonment of roles, but a reorientation. One can still be a doctor, teacher, or parent, but now these roles are seen as expressions, not identities. The individual becomes free to shift, to change, to evolve, without the terror of losing themselves, because the authentic self transcends the role. Real-life illustrations. Consider the story of an artist who worked for decades as a corporate designer. Outwardly, she was respected, well-paid, and admired. Yet inside, she felt numb. She painted in secret, hiding her authentic passion because it seemed impractical. The persona of corporate professional kept her safe but suffocated her creativity. Her awakening came not through sudden enlightenment, but through years of growing dissatisfaction, until one day she realized she could no longer live a divided life. She slowly transitioned to expressing her art publicly, even at the risk of financial instability. The release of the persona brought fear but also profound vitality. Her soul, long suppressed, finally breathed. Or the story of a man raised in a religious environment, where he was expected to be the model believer. His persona was piety, obedience, and moral perfection. Yet privately he wrestled with doubts, desires, and questions. Awakening came when he could no longer bear the hypocrisy of maintaining a perfect facade. He allowed himself to admit his doubts and seek spiritual truth authentically. Though he risked rejection from his community, he gained inner freedom. His release from the persona of perfect believer allowed him to embrace a more honest, complex relationship with the divine. The psychological mechanics of detachment. Jung explained that detaching from the persona involves confrontation with the shadow. The shadow contains all the parts of ourselves denied in service of the persona. For the corporate artist, her shadow contained creativity, sensitivity, and spontaneity traits suppressed in favor of professionalism. For the religious man, his shadow held doubt, desire, and rebellion. When the persona weakens, these shadow elements surge forward. This confrontation is often frightening, but it is the only path toward wholeness. By integrating the shadow, the individual expands beyond the persona and approaches authenticity. Another mechanism is the experience of inflation and deflation. Inflation occurs when one identifies too strongly with the persona, feeling superior, invulnerable, or indispensable. Deflation occurs when the persona collapses and one feels worthless or lost. Both extremes are painful but instructive. Spiritual awakening teaches balance, not to inflate the persona into the whole self, nor to deflate into despair when the persona shifts, but to hold a steady awareness of the deeper self beyond roles. Individuation as the alternative. The slow release of the persona is not about destruction but integration. The healthy individual learns to use the persona consciously rather than unconsciously. They can perform roles when needed, but remain aware that their essence is deeper than any role. This awareness is the hallmark of individuation. The individual becomes flexible, authentic, and whole. They can navigate society without losing their soul. Their actions stem not from fear of rejection, but from alignment with inner truth. Jung saw individuation as the ultimate goal of psychological and spiritual growth. It is the realization of the self, the archetype of wholeness which transcends ego and persona alike. The spiritually awakened person slowly detaches from the persona because they have glimpsed the self. They sense there is more to their being than appearances. This inner knowing drives the painful but liberating journey of letting go. Part 2. Releasing the need to control, from domination to inner mastery. The progression of spiritual awakening inevitably forces an individual to confront the deep-rooted psychological impulse to control over circumstances, over others, over outcomes, and even over oneself in rigid, unhealthy ways. Jungian psychology reveals that the need to control is not merely a conscious preference for order. It emerges from unconscious fears, unresolved complexes, and projections of the shadow. In the eyes of Jung, this obsessive need for external mastery is a substitute for what is missing within true inner mastery. The spiritually awakened person slowly and often painfully learns to release this external grip and redirect energy inward. The transition is not about passivity, but about shifting from domination to alignment with the deeper rhythms of psyche and cosmos. The psychological roots of control. The desire to control begins in childhood. A child's environment often feels overwhelming and unpredictable. Parents, teachers, and authority figures exert power, and the child learns to secure safety through compliance, manipulation, or exerting influence where possible. These early patterns form complexes, inner clusters of memories and emotions that govern adult behavior unconsciously. For example, a child who grew up in a chaotic household may unconsciously vow never to feel helpless again. As an adult, they may try to micromanage every situation, fearful that chaos will return if they release even slight control. Jung explained that such patterns belong to the unconscious domain. They are not rational decisions, but automatic defenses. A person who tries to control a partner's emotions, a colleague's performance, or a child's future is usually projecting an unresolved fear of vulnerability onto the external world. The psyche clings to external mastery because internal uncertainty feels unbearable. Spiritual awakening disrupts this illusion, revealing that external control is never absolute and true. Safety lies only in reconciling the inner world. Control as an illusion. One of Jung's most profound insights was that the psyche contains vast unconscious forces beyond the control of the ego. Dreams, impulses, and archetypal energies arise spontaneously, often contradicting the ego's plans. The ego wants order, predictability, and linear progress. The unconscious follows a different logic: symbolic, non-linear, irrational, but deeply meaningful. The awakened individual realizes that if they cannot even control their dreams or impulses, how could they hope to fully control the external world? The attempt becomes not only futile, but destructive. Efforts to dominate circumstances often generate resistance, leading to cycles of frustration. The need to control becomes a prison. One spends life planning, anticipating, and worrying, yet outcomes still defy expectations. This realization is liberating. Letting go of control does not mean chaos. It means aligning with the deeper wisdom of the unconscious and the synchronicities of life. Jung's concept of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences, illustrates this point. When the ego relaxes its grip, the unconscious and the external world often align in surprising, transformative ways. By surrendering control, the awakened person discovers a deeper order beneath apparent randomness. From outer control to inner mastery, releasing external control is only possible when inner mastery develops. Jung distinguished between repression and conscious regulation. Repression is when the ego forces unwanted impulses into the unconscious, creating shadow material. Regulation, on the other hand, is the conscious acknowledgement and integration of psychic forces. For example, anger may arise unconsciously. A repressive person suppresses it, pretending to be calm, yet the anger leaks out through passive aggression. A controlling person may try to dominate others, forcing situations to avoid anger triggers. The awakened person, however, learns to face the anger consciously, to trace it to its root complex, and to integrate the energy without destructive projection. This is inner mastery. Jungian individuation requires the ego to expand, not by controlling everything, but by forming dialogue with the unconscious. Dreams, symbols, and synchronicities become guides. Instead of suppressing or controlling, the individual listens, interprets, and aligns. Slowly, life shifts from rigid control to conscious co-creation with deeper forces. The archetypal dimension of control archetypes, according to Jung, are universal patterns of the collective unconscious. Among them, the king and warrior archetypes often embody the theme of control. The immature king seeks to dominate, to impose order through power, fearing that without his authority the world will collapse. The immature warrior seeks victory over others, seeing life as conquest. These archetypes, when unbalanced, fuel the ego's obsession with control. But the mature king rules not through domination but through harmony, creating space for each part of the psyche to flourish. The mature warrior directs his energy not toward conquest, but toward inner discipline, facing his own shadow. Spiritual awakening transforms the archetypal dynamic. The controlling impulse is rechanneled, no longer projected outward. It is internalized into self-mastery, compassion, and wisdom. Real-life illustrations. Take the case of a woman who meticulously planned every detail of her family's life: vacations, meals, schedules. Outwardly, she seemed efficient, admirable, a model of organization. Yet beneath, she was plagued by anxiety, insomnia, and resentment when things didn't go according to plan. Her need for control masked a deep fear of abandonment rooted in childhood neglect. As she entered therapy and began exploring her unconscious, she recognized that her compulsion to control was an attempt to prevent chaos from resurfacing. By learning to trust her inner strength and tolerate uncertainty, she slowly relaxed her grip. Ironically, her relationships improved when she stopped micromanaging. What looked like external efficiency was actually inner bondage. Letting go brought both freedom and peace. Or consider a businessman who insisted on controlling every project detail. He distrusted employees, monitored constantly, and obsessed over results. Success was achieved, but at the cost of burnout and alienation. His awakening began when a health crisis forced him to delegate. In the process, he discovered that his need to dominate came from his father's harsh expectations and his fear of failure. By confronting this unconscious complex, he learned to trust others and himself. His leadership shifted from control to empowerment. The external world did not collapse when he released control. It actually flourished. The shadow of control. The shadow in Jung's theory contains all the qualities we disown. Ironically, those who strive to control others are often controlled most by their unconscious. A person obsessed with managing a partner's emotions may themselves be enslaved by fear of rejection. A leader who dictates every detail may secretly feel powerless. Control is often a mask for helplessness. Spiritual awakening requires facing this shadow. When one admits, "I am afraid of being powerless," the compulsion to control begins to loosen. The shadow integrates when we recognize our vulnerability and allow it to exist without denial. Paradoxically, admitting powerlessness becomes the first step toward true empowerment. Practical manifestations of letting go signs that someone is slowly releasing the need for control include 1. Tolerance for uncertainty. They no longer panic when plans shift unexpectedly. 2. Trust in process. They believe outcomes can unfold meaningfully without constant interference. 3. Improved relationships. Partners, colleagues, and children feel freer, less suffocated. 4. Inner calm. Anxiety decreases as the psyche no longer spends energy on constant vigilance. 5. Openness to synchronicity. Life is experienced as a dialogue rather than a battlefield. These shifts are not instantaneous. The psyche resists fearing loss of safety. But with each step, the awakened individual realizes that control was never true safety. It was only a fragile illusion. The role of synchronicity. Jung's idea of synchronicity becomes central when discussing control. Synchronicities are moments when inner states align with outer events, producing meaning beyond causality. A person struggling with grief may suddenly encounter a book, a stranger, or a dream that speaks directly to their pain. These events cannot be controlled or manufactured, yet they occur with striking precision when one releases rigid control. The spiritually awakened person sees synchronicity not as coincidence, but as evidence of a deeper intelligence at work. Instead of forcing outcomes, they cultivate openness. By releasing the ego's compulsion, they create space for the self to orchestrate life with greater wisdom. The shift from domination to alignment. Ultimately, the release of control is a shift from domination to alignment. Domination says life must follow my will. Alignment says I align my will with deeper truth. Domination resists. Change clings to security and fears uncertainty. Alignment embraces flow, recognizes cycles, and trusts that meaning emerges even in unpredictability. Jung described individuation as precisely this, the ego aligning with the self, the central archetype of wholeness. Control dissolves because the ego no longer stands alone, isolated in its fear. It becomes part of a larger, wiser system. The awakened individual discovers that surrender is not weakness, but the highest form of strength, the strength to trust the unconscious, to trust synchronicity, and to trust life itself. Part 3. Letting go of toxic relationships and emotional dependency. The awakening journey inevitably brings the individual into confrontation with the deepest patterns of attachment, the unconscious ways we bond, depend, and remain entangled in toxic relationships. Jungian psychology reveals that much of our relational life is driven not by conscious choice, but by unconscious projections, shadow dynamics, and archetypal compulsions. To awaken spiritually, one must slowly withdraw from the patterns of dependency and toxic bonds, which often mirror unresolved wounds of the psyche. This process is not immediate. It unfolds gradually as one recognizes the hidden forces at play and learns to reclaim the energy invested in destructive attachments. The psychology of toxic bonds. Toxic relationships in Jung's perspective are rarely random. They emerge as constellations of unconscious material, an externalization of what is unresolved within. For example, someone with an unacknowledged abandonment wound may unconsciously gravitate toward partners who are emotionally unavailable, repeating the pain of their early childhood. Another person with suppressed aggression may find themselves entangled with dominating or abusive figures, enacting the shadow they cannot acknowledge in themselves. Jung emphasized the role of projection here. What we cannot see in ourselves, we tend to project onto others, especially those with whom we have deep emotional ties. We fall in love not merely with the person before us, but with the archetypal image, the anima or animus that our unconscious projects onto them. Likewise, we enter toxic dynamics, not simply because of the other's traits, but because our unconscious needs to confront a disowned part of our psyche. Spiritual awakening demands recognition of these dynamics. The toxic partner becomes less a villain and more a mirror, forcing us to confront our inner wounds. Emotional dependency as a psychological complex. Dependency in relationships is often framed in cultural terms, but Jungian psychology sees it as a complex, a cluster of emotions, memories, and patterns anchored in the unconscious. The dependency complex forms when a child's need for love and security is unmet or inconsistently met. The adult, driven by this unconscious complex, seeks in others the unconditional love once denied. They cling desperately, fearing abandonment, tolerating mistreatment, or losing themselves to please the other. In spiritual awakening, individuals begin to recognize that their dependency is not about the current partner, but about the unresolved past. The adult self becomes enslaved by the child's unmet needs. Releasing emotional dependency, therefore, requires inner work, confronting the inner child, acknowledging the pain, and providing the self with the love once denied. Only then can external relationships shift from bondage to genuine connection. The role of the shadow in toxic attachments. The shadow plays a central role in why we stay in destructive relationships. Often the traits we repress, anger, neediness, sexuality, ambition, are embodied by the partner. We feel magnetically drawn, sensing both attraction and repulsion. A woman who represses her own assertiveness may find herself attracted to a domineering man. A man who denies his vulnerability may fall for a fragile partner who embodies his repressed sensitivity. The relationship becomes toxic when the projection is unconscious. Each partner is not relating to the other as they are, but as symbols of their own disowned parts. Awakening requires integrating the shadow. The woman must claim her own assertiveness rather than living it through her partner's aggression. The man must own his vulnerability rather than forcing it onto his partner. Slowly, the projections dissolve, and the relationship either transforms into a conscious union or dissolves because the unconscious contract is broken. Archetypes of toxic relationships. Jung's archetypes help illuminate the patterns of toxic relationships. 1. The devouring mother. An archetype where one partner smothers, controls, and infantilizes the other. This often reflects the individual's unresolved dependency on maternal love. 2. The abusive father. The counterpart where domination, criticism, and power dynamics replay the early experience of paternal authority. 3. The anima divided by animus possession. When one partner embodies the projected opposite sex archetype, the relationship becomes charged with obsession, illusion, and eventual disillusionment. 4. The trickster toxic partners who destabilize, deceive, and create chaos, forcing the other to confront their illusions. In each case, the external partner embodies an inner archetypal force. The spiritually awakened individual gradually recognizes that they are wrestling not only with a person, but with an archetype operating within their psyche. By withdrawing projection, they reclaim their energy and dissolve the toxic pattern. The slow withdrawal process. Letting go of toxic relationships is rarely immediate. The unconscious resists because the toxic bond carries both pain and familiarity. Jung noted that the psyche often prefers suffering that is known to freedom, that is unfamiliar. The familiar wound feels safer than the unknown path of individuation. Therefore, awakening requires patience and courage. The withdrawal begins with awareness. The awakened individual notices the repetition of pain, the cycle of hope and disappointment, the erosion of authenticity. They begin to name the dynamic. This is not love, but dependency. This is not intimacy, but control. Awareness weakens the unconscious hold. The second stage is confrontation. This involves facing the underlying wound, perhaps abandonment, rejection, or unworthiness, and refusing to seek healing through the partner. The individual begins to meet their own need directly through self-compassion therapy or spiritual practice. The final stage is detachment. The toxic bond loses its grip. Sometimes the relationship ends, other times it transforms. The key is that the individual is no longer enslaved. They relate by choice, not by compulsion. Real-life illustrations. Consider a man who repeatedly found himself with partners who criticized and belittled him. Outwardly, he saw them as toxic women. But through Jungian analysis, he discovered that he carried an unconscious mother complex. His mother had been critical and demanding, and he had internalized the belief that love always comes with judgment. His unconscious compelled him to repeat the pattern, seeking resolution. By becoming aware, he realized he was not doomed to replay this dynamic. He began to cultivate inner self-worth, slowly detaching from the need to earn love through suffering. His awakening involved not hating his partners, but understanding the archetypal wound that drew him to them, or a woman who clung desperately to a partner who was emotionally unavailable. She believed she loved him deeply, but in truth she loved the image of salvation he represented. Her father had been distant, and she unconsciously sought to heal the childhood wound through this man. Spiritual awakening came when she realized she was not trying to love him, but to fix her father through him. By grieving the original wound and giving herself the love she never received, she released her dependency. The toxic bond dissolved and she discovered freedom. Signs of awakening in relationships. The transition from toxic dependency to conscious relating manifests in several ways. 1. Reduced tolerance for abuse. The awakened person no longer rationalizes mistreatment. 2. Clarity of boundaries. They establish clear emotional and physical boundaries without guilt. 3. Shift from need to choice. They engage in relationships because they choose to, not because they must. 4. Integration of the shadow. They reclaim traits once projected, reducing obsession and compulsion. 5. Alignment with the self-relationships become vehicles of growth, not prisons of repetition. These signs do not appear all at once. They emerge gradually as the individual reclaims their soul from unconscious patterns. The inner alchemy of love. Jung often compared individuation to alchemy, the transformation of base material into gold. In relationships, the base material is toxic dependency. The suffering, jealousy, and obsession are the raw elements. The alchemical fire is the confrontation with shadow and projection. Through this process, love transforms from need to essence, from compulsion to conscious union. In true spiritual awakening, love is no longer about filling a void, but about sharing fullness. The awakened individual does not seek in another what they lack. They seek to co-create meaning. Relationships cease to be battlegrounds of complexes and become mirrors of the self. The toxic dissolves and the sacred emerges. Practical steps. In Jungian perspective, the path out of toxic dependency involves inner practices, dream work, observing how the unconscious presents relational dynamics symbolically. A dream of being trapped often mirrors dependency. Active imagination, dialoguing with inner figures representing the partner, discovering what they symbolize internally. Shadow work, owning repressed traits that were projected onto the toxic partner. Inner child healing, meeting the unmet needs of childhood directly rather than through partners. Boundaries practice, learning to say no to honor the self rather than sacrifice it. Each step reclaims psychic energy. Slowly, the individual disentangles from external toxicity and discovers inner wholeness. The emergence of authentic connection. When toxic relationships dissolve, space opens for authentic connection. Jung described this as the integration of anima and animus within the inner masculine and feminine, finding balance. When these archetypes are integrated, one no longer seeks completion through another, but meets the other as an equal. Authentic intimacy becomes possible because it is not rooted in projection or dependency. The spiritually awakened person no longer tolerates relationships that diminish their soul. Instead, they attract or create relationships that honor authenticity, depth, and mutual growth. This is not idealization but reality. When the unconscious compulsion dissolves, love can finally be chosen freely. Part 4. Letting go of unconscious living and the escape from the inner world. Jungian depth psychology insists that the greatest danger for modern individuals is not external threats, but unconscious living, the passive submission to routines, habits, and distractions that prevent us from ever facing the reality of our inner world. Spiritual awakening disrupts this pattern. It forces us to confront the truth that much of life has been spent in avoidance, avoiding inner pain, inner conflict, and the shadow that lurks beneath daily consciousness. The spiritually awakened person slowly releases these unconscious habits of escape. They stop numbing, stop running, and begin to turn inward toward the neglected psyche. This step marks one of the most painful and transformative phases of awakening. The nature of unconscious living. For Jung, unconscious living means being driven by forces one does not recognize. Most people believe they act rationally, but in truth their lives are governed by complexes, instincts, and cultural conditioning. One might pursue wealth not because it brings meaning, but because an inner complex of inadequacy compels them to prove worth. Another might stay in routines of comfort not because they truly desire it, but because their psyche fears the disruption of individuation. Unconscious living appears harmless on the surface, working, consuming, socializing, but underneath it drains the soul. Jung compared it to living under a spell. A person functions but never really awakens to their own depths. Spiritual awakening breaks the spell. It reveals the emptiness of mechanical existence and compels one to begin the work of consciousness. Escape as a defense mechanism. The human psyche, according to Jung, instinctively resists facing its own darkness. Instead of confronting anxiety, grief, or shadow impulses, people create strategies of escape. Some immerse themselves in constant work, distracting themselves with productivity. Others drown in entertainment, consumption, or addictions. Even spirituality can become an escape when used to bypass pain rather than face it. These escapes are defense mechanisms. They shield the ego from the overwhelming force of the unconscious. But over time, they rob life of vitality. The psyche grows restless. Symptoms arise: depression, meaninglessness, irritability, chronic dissatisfaction. The unconscious does not disappear simply because it is ignored. It demands recognition. Spiritual awakening often begins when these escapes no longer work. The pleasures that once numbed the pain lose their power. The distractions feel hollow. The individual senses an inner call to stop running. The shadow as the avoided reality. The primary reason for escape is the shadow. The shadow contains everything the ego refuses to acknowledge: rage, envy, fear, shame, but also hidden talents and vitality. Facing the shadow feels dangerous because it threatens the ego's self-image. People avoid this confrontation by living superficially. They fill schedules with noise, surround themselves with superficial relationships, or drown themselves in substances. But Jung taught that wholeness requires shadow integration. The longer the shadow is avoided, the more destructive it becomes. It erupts through projections, compulsions, or psychological collapse. The spiritually awakened person learns slowly to turn toward the shadow instead of running. They begin the painful work of recognition. This anger is mine. This envy is mine. This longing is mine. Escape ends when ownership begins. The crisis of meaning unconscious living often sustains itself until a crisis erupts. Jung described the midlife crisis as one such moment. Around midlife, the persona and routines that sustained earlier life lose their power. The career, family, or roles that once seemed fulfilling no longer satisfy. The unconscious pushes forward, demanding recognition. For some, this manifests as depression or emptiness. For others, it appears as compulsive, searching new relationships, new jobs, new hobbies, anything to escape the inner void. The spiritually awakened person interprets this crisis differently. They recognize it as the soul demanding attention. Instead of seeking external fixes, they begin to turn inward. They realize that the emptiness is not a flaw, but an invitation, the call to awaken from unconscious living and to embrace individuation. Real-life illustrations. Take the case of a man who spent decades in corporate life, working tirelessly, climbing the ladder, seeking recognition. Outwardly, he succeeded, but inside, he felt dead. His nights were filled with insomnia, his days with irritability. He drowned his unease in alcohol, telling himself it was just stress. Eventually, his health broke down and he could no longer sustain the illusion. Awakening began when he admitted that his work had been an escape, not a calling. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask, "What do I really want?" The path was painful, but it marked the end of unconscious living. Or consider a woman who filled her life with constant social activity, parties, events, endless chatter. She feared silence, for in silence she would hear the grief she carried from childhood. For years she escaped through busyness, but after a loss the distractions no longer soothed her. She began therapy, reluctantly facing her pain. Slowly she realized that her avoidance had cut her off, not only from grief, but also from joy. By releasing the compulsion to escape, she discovered a depth of life she had never known. The role of dreams in breaking avoidance. Jung insisted that the unconscious communicates through dreams. For those living unconsciously, dreams often reveal the reality they avoid. Someone who suppresses anger may dream of fire or explosions. Someone who avoids grief may dream of funerals or abandoned children. These dreams are not random, but invitations to face the shadow. The spiritually awakened individual pays attention. Instead of dismissing dreams, they record and reflect on them. Each symbol becomes a guide toward the avoided truth. Slowly, dreams dissolve the illusion of unconscious living and point the way toward integration. Active imagination as confrontation. Another tool Jung emphasized was active imagination, a process of engaging directly with unconscious figures. Instead of escaping, the individual closes their eyes, enters a meditative state, and dialogues with the images that arise. A fearful figure might represent repressed trauma. A seductive figure might embody disowned desire. By engaging rather than avoiding, the individual breaks the pattern of escape. This practice demands courage. It forces the ego to witness what it has long denied. Yet it also brings vitality. The shadow, once integrated, releases energy previously spent on suppression. Life becomes richer because the unconscious is no longer the enemy but a partner in growth. The death of distraction. Letting go of unconscious habits often feels like death. The ego fears that without distractions, life will be unbearable. But in truth, it is the distractions that suffocate. Awakening requires enduring the discomfort of silence, boredom, or pain. Instead of reaching for the phone, the drink, or the next project, the awakened person learns to sit with themselves. This discipline reveals treasures. Beneath the surface noise lies creativity, intuition, and connection with the self. Jung described the self as the archetype of wholeness, the center of the psyche. To meet the self, one must pass through the desert of silence where all escapes dissolve. The spiritually awakened person discovers that freedom lies not in avoiding the inner world, but in embracing it. Signs of awakening. Through confronting the inner world. 1. Decreased reliance on addictions. Old habits of numbing lose their power. 2. Increased capacity for solitude, silence, and aloneness no longer terrify but nurture. 3. Emergence of creativity. Suppressed energy re-emerges in art, writing, or innovation. 4. Emotional depth. The individual feels grief, anger, and joy more fully, no longer fearing intensity. 5. Integration of shadow traits. Traits once denied are acknowledged and harnessed constructively. These are not instant changes, but gradual signs that unconscious living is giving way to conscious presence. Archetypal framework. The night sea journey. In myth and Jungian symbolism, the confrontation with the unconscious often takes the form of a night sea journey, a descent into darkness before the emergence of light. Heroes in myth are swallowed by the sea, trapped in the underworld, or lost in the forest. These images symbolize the ego entering the unconscious, stripped of its escapes. For the awakened individual, the night sea journey may feel like depression, loss, or existential emptiness. Yet this descent is necessary. It is not punishment but initiation. By enduring the darkness without escape, one emerges, renewed, aligned with deeper truth. The reorientation of life. When unconscious living dissolves, life reorients. Priorities shift. Instead of chasing distractions, the awakened person seeks depth. Work becomes not just productivity, but expression of soul. Relationships become not just social roles, but genuine connection. Leisure becomes not numbing, but nurturing. This reorientation is subtle yet profound. The same external life may remain job, family, community, but the inner attitude transforms. The person is no longer asleep within their routines. They are awake, conscious, and engaged. Part 5. Letting go of fear and the limits of the mind. The final and perhaps most profound step in the slow release of attachments during spiritual awakening involves fear, the pervasive, paralyzing force that shapes the ego's prison. For Jung, fear is not simply an emotional reaction. It is a psychic barrier created by the ego to protect itself from transformation. Fear keeps the individual bound to routines, to persona, to toxic relationships, to unconscious habits. To awaken spiritually is to slowly loosen fear's grip and transcend the self-imposed limits of the mind. Only then can the individual move toward individuation, the realization of the self. The archetypal roots of fear. Fear is archetypal. It emerges not only from personal trauma, but from the collective unconscious. The archetype of the shadow embodies much of what humans fear: darkness, death, chaos, the unknown. Culturally, myths of monsters, devils, and underworld journeys symbolize these fears. Jung argued that humanity's dread of the unknown mirrors the ego's dread of the unconscious. The ego fears dissolution. It clings to control, certainty, and identity. Yet individuation demands that the ego expand beyond its narrow boundaries. Fear arises precisely at this threshold. When the unconscious calls, when the soul demands growth, the ego resists. What will happen if I change? Will I survive? Will I lose myself? The spiritually awakened person recognizes fear not as truth, but as resistance. Slowly they learn to face it, to enter the darkness, willingly knowing it is the path toward wholeness. The illusion of safety. Much of fear is rooted in the illusion of safety. The ego believes it can avoid suffering by staying small, remaining in the known job, the familiar relationship, the predictable habits. But Jung observed that suffering does not vanish through avoidance. Instead, it transforms into neurosis, emptiness, or restlessness. Safety becomes a cage. The spiritually awakened person begins to see that the mind's limits, its fears of failure, rejection, or inadequacy, are not truths, but defenses. The ego whispers, "Do not risk authenticity, you will be rejected." But the unconscious urges, "Claim yourself." Fear appears as the guardian at the threshold, daring the individual to step forward. The release of fear does not happen at once. It comes through repeated acts of courage, small steps, where one proves that the mind's catastrophes are illusions. Fear of change. One of the strongest fears is the fear of change. Jung noted that the psyche resists transformation, preferring stagnation even when painful. Change threatens the ego's identity. To leave a toxic relationship, to quit an empty career, to embrace authenticity, all feel like death to the ego. Spiritual awakening reframes change not as death but as rebirth. The dissolution of the old makes space for the new. Jung compared this to alchemy. The material must be broken down before gold emerges. Fear of change diminishes when the individual experiences this cycle repeatedly. Each time something old collapses and something new arises, trust in the process grows. Fear of failure and rejection. The ego is deeply invested in acceptance. Social belonging ensures survival, and rejection feels like annihilation. Fear of failure and rejection thus dominate many lives. People suppress dreams, silence voices, and conform to roles because they fear exclusion. But Jung emphasized that individuation requires breaking from collective norms. The self cannot emerge if one lives only for approval. Spiritual awakening involves slowly withdrawing energy from the fear of others' judgments. This does not mean defiance for its own sake, but authenticity, even when it risks disapproval. The awakened individual learns that rejection does not annihilate the self, it liberates it. Fear of the shadow. Perhaps the deepest fear is fear of one's own shadow. The ego constructs an image of itself good, moral, competent, and fears anything that contradicts this. Rage, lust, greed, envy, these qualities are buried, denied, and feared. Yet Jung taught that until the shadow is faced, it dominates from below. Fear of the shadow keeps people fragmented. The spiritually awakened person begins the work of shadow integration. Instead of running, they confront their darkness. They admit, yes, I have anger. Yes, I feel envy. Yes, I am capable of selfishness. Paradoxically, this honesty reduces fear. The shadow loses its terror when it is acknowledged. What was once feared as a monster becomes recognized as a disowned part of the self, capable of transformation. Fear of death. Death is the archetypal fear behind all others. Jung considered confrontation with mortality essential for individuation. The ego clings to life fearing annihilation, yet the unconscious through dreams and myths reveals death as transformation, not end. Myths of descent into the underworld, of resurrection and renewal, symbolize the psyche's understanding that death is part of life's cycle. Spiritual awakening involves slowly releasing fear of death. This does not mean recklessness, but acceptance. The awakened individual senses that the self transcends physical existence. They align with a deeper continuity of life. In this acceptance, many other fears dissolve, for they are but echoes of the ultimate fear. Real-life illustrations. Consider a woman who longed to write but feared rejection. For years she hid her voice, convinced she would fail. Her awakening came when she realized her fear was not truth but projection of her inner critic. She began writing trembling, but discovered acceptance was irrelevant. Expression itself was liberation. Fear diminished as authenticity grew. Or a man trapped in a career he hated, afraid to leave because of financial risk. His body broke down with stress until he could no longer ignore the cost. By confronting his fear of failure, he transitioned to a vocation aligned with his soul. The predicted catastrophes never came. Instead, opportunities emerged. His awakening lay in discovering that fear had been the only prison. Practices for releasing fear from a Jungian perspective. Several practices support the slow release of fear. Dream work. Facing the fears revealed symbolically in dreams rather than avoiding them. Shadow journaling, writing down feared qualities, owning them consciously. Active imagination. Engaging with fearful figures in imagination, dialoguing rather than fleeing. Exposure to vulnerability, small acts of authenticity, proving that fear's predictions rarely manifest. Meditative silence. Sitting with fear without distraction, discovering its impermanence. Each practice retrains the psyche. Slowly, the individual proves to themselves that fear is not a final truth but a threshold. Signs of fear, releasing its grip. One greater risk. taking in authenticity. The person dares to speak truth, pursue dreams, or leave roles. 2. Calm in uncertainty. They tolerate the unknown without panic. 3. Compassion for self and others. Fear transforms into empathy when the shadow is acknowledged. 4. Openness to transformation. Change becomes opportunity, not catastrophe. 5. Alignment with the self-decisions arise not from fear but from inner truth. These signs reflect the ego's shift from defense to trust. The mind's limits dissolve and life expands. The archetypal journey through fear. Jung often referenced myths of heroes confronting monsters. The dragon or beast symbolizes the fear guarding treasure. The hero who confronts rather than flees discovers the gold of the self. Spiritually awakened individuals live this archetypal story inwardly. Their monsters are fears of rejection, change, shadow, or death. By facing them, they claim the treasure of wholeness, beyond the limits of the mind. Ultimately, the slow release of fear leads beyond the limits of the mind. The ego, once dominated by fear, opens to the vastness of the unconscious and the archetype of the self. The mind no longer defines reality through limits: what is safe, what is acceptable, what is possible. Instead, the individual discovers freedom, creativity, and meaning beyond fear. This is not the absence of fear, but its transformation. Fear becomes signal, not prison, threshold, not end. Which stage do you find yourself in, letting go of persona-controlled toxic love, unconscious habits, or fear itself? Share your journey in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell to join us as we explore the depths of spirituality and Carl Jung's psychology.